happy Victober, everyone. We are celebrating the 10th anniversary of Victober. And I wanted to do a couple things on my channel that I thought sounded fun. And one is to really begin to dig deeper into Victorian writers. Thanks to folks like my guest today, I've hit the major hits. I've read Dickens and Gaskell and the Brontes, but I want to dig deeper. So I've been turning to some enthusiasts and experts of Victorian literature, and I thought how appropriate it would be to have, as Dickens might say, the founder of the feast here with us, Katie Lumsden from Books and Things. Katie, welcome.
Hi, very nice to be here. Happy Victober, everyone.
What I want to talk about today, and desperately try not to get off topic as I'm wont to do, but is talk to some people about Victorian writers who need maybe more attention, more love, as it were. If you're like me and you've read the highlights, where can we start digging in deeper? And you've brought a writer here to share with us today, Katie. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about her?
Yes, so I brought along, Amy Dillwyn. So I've got three of her books here. And Amy
Mhm.
Dillwyn is a wonderful writer. So she was a Welsh writer in the Victorian period. And she, wrote quite a few novels. And I've loved everything I've read by her. And I'm really excited to read more. And she is pretty underrated. She's not hugely well known. And she should be more well known. And I think because there are quite a lot of very famous Victorian books, sometimes we think that we know all of the Victorian writers, whereas actually there's a lot of Victorian writers that don't get enough love, and that are really fascinating. And also some of the books that don't survive, they don't sort of retain a place in popular culture. Sometimes the reason why they don't do that is because they're quite different, or because they're quite subversive, or because they're doing something that is really different, and therefore they weren't necessarily as popular, or they haven't necessarily become a classic, but actually they're really, really fascinating. And Amy Dillwyn is definitely one of those writers. So yeah, I've got three books by her here, so I'll talk about these three. So the first one I read by her is the Rebecca Rioter, which is a really interesting novel. So this was published in 1880, but it's set in the early 19th century, about a real historical event called the Rebecca Rioters. In Wales in, I think it was the 1830s, but earlier in the 19th century, there was a lot of unrest about how much road tolls cost. And groups of men dressed up in women's clothes, calling themselves Rebecca, as a disguise, and destroyed the tolls. And this is a real historical event that's really interesting. And in this book, Amy Dillwyn writes it from the perspective of someone who has been a Rebecca writer. And I think this book is fascinating for lots of reasons, but one reason why I think it's really worth a read is because it looks really interestingly at 19th century Wales, and the ways in which 19th century Wales is different from 19th century England, and also how different things are when class boundaries are drawn across language boundaries. So the main character speaks Welsh, because he's from a working class background, but he can read a bit of English, and he ends up befriending a young lady who's part of the aristocracy, the upper classes, who speaks English primarily. And it's just a really, really fascinating book, and with a lot of really interesting historical context. And another really interesting thing about it is that Amy Dillwyn, when writing it, because she spoke Welsh and English, wanted to capture the syntax of Welsh in the way she wrote the dialogue in English. So the dialogue reads slightly differently, and that's because she's trying to capture the phraseology and syntax of Welsh, which is really fun. And it's just a really fascinating and very different book. Like I said, I think one thing that a lot of these sort of forgotten writers, actually you can find some really fascinating and quite different books from them. And then I also have here Jill, which is the second book I've read by her. And all of these books are published by Furneaux Press, who are a really great Welsh publisher, who publish some contemporary literature, but also some Welsh classics. And Jill is about a woman called Jill. She is from the upper classes, but she's not very happy with her life. So she decides she's going to run away from home and become a servant and take her life into her own hands. And Jill is just everything that a Victorian woman is not supposed to be. She breaks all of the boundaries. She is very clearly in love with the woman that she works for. Like, I think this is, in terms of Victorian literature, this is one of the books I've read where it's like the most clear that there is a woman in love with another woman. There's not really another way you could read that. Jill is in love with Kitty and likes working for her because she is devoted to her in a very romantic way. And yeah, this book just follows Jill's life and all her antics as she lies and cheats and gets into all kinds of scrapes and has the kind of adventure story that usually only men get in Victorian books. And Jill is just, yeah, absolutely fascinating. And one of those very surprising Victorian books that, yeah, you almost can't believe was written when it was written. And it's just great. And the final book I've read by her is A Burglary, which is a really interesting novel, which looks at various families in sort of the upper classes in Wales, and what happens when an heiress is robbed of her jewels. And the book partly looks at the family who have experienced the burglary, but also looks at the mind and the psychology of the burglar and why he has done this, and kind of unpicks all of these things in a fascinating way. And this is, yeah, another really, really great book. And there's so much I love about Amy Dillwyn. I think she writes really different and unusual books. And she also, like, her writing style is just really smooth and readable and really, really enjoyable. And she's definitely an author I want to read everything by at some point.
Yeah, for sure. I've read A Burglary, and it's been a couple years, I think. I won the book on from Kate Howe and her Patreon. She had a contest, or she has a monthly contest or something. I don't even remember now. It's been a while. but yeah, Kate sent that to me, and so I read it and really enjoyed it. And she was somebody I had heard of through your channel. I know you've recommended Jill quite a few times. And I'm hoping to get to that one either later this year or maybe next year. But yeah, A Burglary was just a lot of fun, as I remember reading it. Yeah.
It's a real page turner, and there's a lot of like unexpected things that happen, which just makes it great fun. Like, Amy Dillwyn just writes the kind of books that are always quite unexpected. And even, like, I think A Burglary is in a way, probably the least subversive of the three. But even then, it has a lot of like fascinating stuff in, and the plot goes in all kinds of direction. And like the dramatic finale is great as well. Really, really good.
Jill, that book fascinates me because that's a topic you don't normally read in Victorian literature. As you were saying, I don't know a lot about Amy Dillwyn's life. I don't know if you've read anything about her.
Yeah. So she was a very interesting person as well. She had quite an unusual life because she was a woman, but she inherited her family's business. So she was kind of also an industrialist. And she was quite unconventional when it came to gender boundaries. So she liked to wear men's clothes and smoke cigars. And she was engaged to a man who died, I believe. But there was also a woman who she had a sort of close romantic friendship with, and in her diary she wrote lots of things about being in love with her, but whether or not it was requited is a bit unclear. But there are bits of Amy Dillwyn's diaries where she says, that there's a really interesting quote from one of her diaries where she said something like, "I think that my soul is half a man's, and the man's part of my soul fell in love with this woman," or something like that. And so I would love to read her diaries. I've been trying to get hold of them. There's a university press in Wales that has published her diaries, and you can like write in an order for a copy. So I think I'm going to do that because I'd love to read them in full. Because she was such an interesting person, and I think especially like in terms of understanding how people in the Victorian period might have understood their own sexuality, I think there would probably be a lot of interesting things in Amy Dillwyn's writing. And also she had a very interesting life in terms of her like work as an industrialist and as a writer. And yeah, she's a very, very interesting figure. And I think you can kind of tell that from her books and how much they challenge Victorian sort of social convention and norms, I suppose.
I I was thinking there was another book I was looking up that kind of deals with that unspoken perhaps affection or love between in this case two men. Is it John Halifax, Gentleman?
Yeah.
Yeah, and his best friend Phineas. I was just reading that there. I remember that one kind of following almost that same line as what we were talking about with Jill. Like, is this unrequited love here, or is it just deep male friendship? And how do we know what is trying to be implied?
It's also quite interesting. In So one thing I think, if I ever were to go back to university and do a PhD in Victorian literature, I would love to do a PhD on, what do I always call the topic in my mind? Disability and rebellion within Victorian literature. Because something else you see in Victorian literature quite a lot is characters like Phineas from John Halifax Gentleman, who are disabled, and therefore, like, Victorian society isn't expecting them to fit into particular molds because they already don't fit into Victorian society in one way. Therefore, sometimes you find quite often within Victorian literature characters with disabilities who are also queer coded in some way or who have a very strong romantic friendship with someone of the same gender. So you see that in John Halifax Gentleman. You see that with a character like Smike, I think, and Nicholas Nickleby. I definitely think he's in love with Nicholas. And there's a character in Drama and Muslin by George Moore as well. And you see that quite a lot where it's almost like a Victorian author can say, well, you're not expecting this person to have a conventional Victorian love story anyway, so I'm going to give them a different kind of love story in a way. And that's something I find really interesting in John Halifax Gentleman. Like, I think that's definitely there. It's always interesting when you find those things in Victorian literature, because I think actually you find a lot of that in Victorian literature. Like, actually beneath the surface, there's lots of people living unconventional lives that wouldn't have been sort of recognized in a certain sense within the Victorian period, but also you can tell from novels that there was an understanding that not all people conformed to what Victorian society said was what you're meant to conform to, I suppose.
And I remember, Dinah Craik, who wrote that, John Halifax, she also wrote Olive, and that has to deal with disability as well, if I remember right.
Yeah. Dinah Craik writes quite a lot about that.
Yeah.
Really complexly, I think.
Yeah. That might be another writer to have in my series here.
Yeah. Well, I do. Yeah. I really recommend her a lot, and I recommend Olive a lot. It's great. And yeah, I think sometimes if you scratch the surface of Victorian literature, it can feel like the portrayals of disability you get are quite like surface villainy or victimhood, and actually that you get that in some books, but actually there's a lot more complicated things going on, and there's a lot of like quite like rich and complex exploration of living with disability in quite a lot of Victorian books. And I think Dinah Craik is one of the authors who writes about that really well. And I think Charlotte Mary Young as well. I've only read one of her books, but I gather she writes quite a lot about chronic illness and disability in quite an interesting way in a lot of her books.
I haven't read her at all. I'm gonna read my first one for Victober. I'll be doing a buddy read, so I'm excited about that because she's one who will be discussed in this series. Kate Howe, if you know her, no surprise. She's a champion for young. So I finally decided, got to see what all the fuss is about. So I was trying to find where I had read this, but it was it was about Dickens, and I'm not sure if it was in connection with Smike or another character he wrote in it was Little Dorrit, maybe. I can't remember now, but whether or not this person was a queer person or not. And I whoever wrote this kind of was pushing back against the idea that, well, they wouldn't have really talked about that or known about those things, which probably isn't true in that sense. But he said something like it's possible that he was writing it not even realizing that's what he was doing, because he's such an observer of people around him. He's like, oh, I know some people who act like that. And it turns out, they were, gay or lesbian, and he didn't realize it, and then wrote those characters and characteristics into a character, which I thought was kind of interesting.
I read a really interesting book when I was at university called Queer Dickens by Holly Furneaux, which is all about kind of like it's a literary, academic literary criticism looking at Dickens's books through sort of queer theory. And she talks a lot about how, yeah, there are lots of pairs of characters um, within Dickens that you can read that way. People like Captain Cuttle and Solomon Gills in Dombey and Son, and Phil and Mr. George in Bleak House. There is one scene where like Phil is watching George wash, which is quite like sexualized. I definitely think they're in love. But also she talks about how in a lot of Dickens books, there is a praising of unconventional family structures, and most of the like happy families in Dickens, like a lot of them are surrogate families and families made up of people who aren't biologically related, and people who found each other. And actually the sort of found family element in Dickens is also like a nice way of accepting that not all families have to look the same, and that not all families have to look the way Victorian society would probably say that they were expecting them to look. So I think you can find a lot of that in Victorian literature, and there's actually like, yeah, there's so much beneath the surface in Victorian literature. And like you say, maybe that is, things that weren't, just because something wasn't discussed all the time doesn't mean people didn't understand that that was a part of life for some people, but also authors could have observed the relationships between people that they didn't actually fully understand, and could have put them on the page as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I think reading books like Jill will be interesting to see how she handles that. And side note, if you all were playing a drinking game or something about if we could not mention Dickens at all, you've lost. So sorry. That's going to be my next one I read by her, because I want to read more by Amy Dillwyn, certainly. And then you brought up the Rebecca riots. So is that would that be considered or that book be considered like a historical fiction?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, because it's set,
Victorian.
Yeah, it's set I think at least 50 years before it's was published. So yeah, that'd be historical fiction to my mind. And it's really, really interesting. Really interesting, especially in terms of like Welsh history. Like obviously, Amy Dillwyn was Welsh, and like Jill is not. I think maybe a little bit of Jill takes place in Wales, but it's mostly not. But A Burglary, some of it takes place in Wales, and the Rebecca Rioter is really sort of about Welsh history and about the ways in which the class system is the same but also different between Wales and England. And I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of the time when people think about Victorian Britain, they're actually thinking about Victorian England, or indeed about Victorian London and the home counties, or maybe a mill town in the north. But actually looking at like how different bits of Britain were different is really, really interesting when you're looking at social history, I think, and a literary history.
Yeah, and that book would also help you get one of the Victober prompts too. So.
Indeed. And indeed, all of Amy Dillwyn's books would count for Elizabeth's prompt, which is to read a work by an underrated Victorian woman writer, because Amy Dillwyn is definitely underrated.
Yeah. Earlier we mentioned Charlotte Mary Young, and it could be thanks to some very vocal people on BookTube. She might not be underrated for much longer, which would be great. Just also real quick, how did you first come across how did you find out about Amy Dillwyn and her books?
I found out about her through the publisher, Furneaux Press. I think. I'm trying to remember. I know they sent me a review copy, and I can't now remember whether I had heard about them on YouTube, so spoke about the Rebecca Rioter, and then they sent me a copy of Jill, or whether they sent me a copy of the Rebecca Rioter and then I bought a copy of Jill. I can't remember. But I did have some contact with the publisher a while ago. And I think they're a really great publisher, and it's really nice they're bringing back books into print that were otherwise relatively forgotten. So these are the three they published, and I do want to read more by Amy Dillwyn, which I think I need to get digitally. But yeah, they also publish Alan Rain is another Welsh Victorian author who I know. I've read Garth Owen by her, which was good, and I know Kate's read A Welsh Witch, which she really liked as well. Good for Furneaux Press.
All right, yeah. So it's good to remember. Victorian doesn't mean just in England, like you were saying. It's covers Wales and Scotland and Ireland, I think. Right, and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on and sharing this new newish to me writer anyway. I look forward to reading more. Looks like she has a little bit of a catalog to read through. So I guess before we wrap up real quick, I got to let you plug your books or your channel, which
Yeah, so I run the channel Books and Things, and I talk about Victorian literature and historical fiction and classics and various things. And I'm also a writer. I write historical fiction set in the Victorian period, unsurprisingly. So I've had two books out now, The Secrets of Howard Hall and The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, which is just out in paperback this year.
all right. Now I'm looking for a scoop here. Do you have a third book coming out or
I mean, hopefully one day, who can
okay.
say? Out of my hands, but
Got it.
hopefully, yeah. I am writing, but we will see.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. So everyone run out, read Amy Dillwyn. Let me know what you think. And thanks for watching today.